end. Okay, without further ado.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the afternoon session, the last one of the first day. Thank you. You're the strong, and you have lasted the entire first day. Yay. We're glad you're here. We are crawling inside the black box of greenhouse homes. Don't you want to know what is inside the box? And what is it that really makes greenhouse homes, small house homes, what is it that really makes those things work well? So I am not doing this alone. My name is Susan Frazier. I happen to be the Senior Director of the National Greenhouse Project, and I am joined by my very good friend, Cheryl Van Bemden. So here's the deal. In my dreams, I have operated a greenhouse home. But just in my dreams, I have never, ever operated or operationalized a greenhouse home. And I say fondly, I do it vicariously through our adopters every day. And every opportunity I can to talk to our adopters, to hear their stories, that's what gives me energy. It's what brings life to me. So thank you, Cheryl, because she will be our storyteller. Marla and I are going to do the research part, and Cheryl is the storyteller. And last but not least, my esteemed colleague, Marla DeVries, and she will be sharing one of the research studies with me. So let's get started. So the writing is on the wall, as they say. What if we just wait and something magical happens? Who needs to change? Well, if you can see that, it's the profits and everything are going down. So I'm thinking culture change is no longer optional, that we've got... So I'm going to tell you at the very beginning what that the more radical and comprehensive change, when that happens radically and comprehensively, that's when outcomes, that's when we have the opportunity for impact. That what I'm saying is you can't incrementally just do a little of this and maybe a little of that. I'm saying don't have to. And really think about all those three areas, the philosophy, not just the environment, philosophy, the environment, and as my dear friend Anna Ortegar would say, the least sexy part, the organizational redesign. And it is doing all three of those things that really bring opportunities for meaningful impact. The second thing I want to say is sustainability doesn't just happen. And what is the role of decision making in sustaining culture change? I can tell you decision making has everything to do, one decision at a time. And we're going to unpack the research that will tell us a little bit more about that. So to get us started, we're going to kind of acknowledge the fact that the research we're sharing is research that was done on the greenhouse model. So for those of you who might have lived under a rock and you don't know exactly what the greenhouse model is, I thought I would just try to help you understand a little bit to make sure we understand what it is. So the reality is it is building on the Eden alternative. Dr. Bill Thomas, you've heard him talked about a lot at this conference. He was one of those pioneers who had an incredible idea. When he went into a nursing home years ago and he had an elder with a rash on her arm, he's writing the prescription on her chart. She pulls him down and says, "Doctor, I am so lonely." And it was that life-changing moment that he said life can be different. And he and his wife Jude came up with the 10 principles for the Eden alternative. Later, when he recognized nursing homes were in dire need of being rebuilt, he thought, what would the ideal environment be for those principles to live, grow, and thrive? And what he came up with was the greenhouse model. So here's the deal about that. He said, assisted living has made a lot of progress in creating real homes. What we within the current regulatory and reimbursement structures, that there was already the mechanism for elders to be able to have home for life, and they wouldn't have to move if they exhausted their financial resources or their acuity level would change. And so, true to form, that comprehensive change that I started our session with, philosophically, what culture, philosophically, will you move into that changed environment? And the organizational design, in order to get power to elders, you've got to flatten the hierarchy. So I'm going to do my best. I've got a new computer here. I'm going to try to pull up our video to take you kind of inside a greenhouse home. So cross your fingers, and we will hope that this will work.
I think I was honored, really. Find a home where I could stay and live and be. When I came over here, I wanted that shared along with me, because that's been with me all my life, really. Makes me feel like I'm home.
It's much better here than it was over there. I can do more here for myself. I can walk around, I go in the kitchen.
Just some milk and some butter, kind of simmering.
I love my room. I don't have to share that with no one. I have everything here to myself. Yeah, I feel safe here.
To have my mother-in-law here is the next best thing to being at home.
I'm waiting to get a cup of coffee.
It almost looks like you're walking into a living room. The bedrooms are off to the side, 10 private rooms with private baths, and there's always someone cooking. It's more of a very homey, warm setting.
The goal is a complete transformation of the way we currently deliver skilled nursing care. So we want to move from an institutional setting, the setting that when you or I walk into it, we think, please don't ever let me have to live here. And how to transform that into something warm and to create a home that you or I would walk into and think, I'd be happy living here because it's like the home I would have myself.
We don't have a nursing station. We have a little small area that we work out of in the library. We could provide just as good care, if not better, here because of the small environment, and we're interacting with them all throughout the time that we're here. And so we notice things. We notice if there's one little thing, if they've got a sniffle, we notice that. We know them so well. It's a holistic approach.
There you go, and you got a perfect pulse too.
Greenhouse homes are staffed with a variety of different individuals who all play an important part in bringing the care and services to the home. The key team is a group of people that we call Shabazim. That's the plural of the word Shabaz. They provide care, they provide all the services that are needed within the home.
In this situation, there's nobody that gets overlooked. Nobody, because we are with them every day. And so I guess what draws is that you can really be involved with them and make their life better.
The Shabazz seem to see things a little better. They know those residents so well that when somebody's starting to not feel well or their appetite changes, they know immediately what's going on. The transition I've seen has been phenomenal. I've seen weight gain. I've seen residents on puree diets who've been on puree for years come off of it and start eating regular textures. And it's things like that that make this whole concept worthwhile.
You guys getting hungry? Once you experience the change that occurs with the elders and with their family members, it will be very affirming that you've done the right thing. The only regret that you'll have is having not done it earlier.
Yes. I'm glad it came back. So just very quickly, I talked about the philosophy. In Greenhouse Home, we kind of centered that empowering those work. And last but not least, that core value of real home, and not just home-like, but real home, and really seeking to maintain the sanctity of a real home. So that having been said, I think as a nurse, what was always so important to me, I always used to say, the proof is in the outcomes. Show me the outcomes, show me the evidence base, that it really doesn't just feel good, but that it really is good. So fortunately, the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation funded a longitudinal study of greenhouse homes. They collected data from 2011 to 2014, and we had some incredibly highly esteemed researchers. You can see a little bit about where they hailed from, pretty impressive places, I might say. So the first thing that they really wanted to know was, what about the care processes in a greenhouse home? And how might those care processes really influence and impact outcomes? So specifically, what they wanted to take a look at is, what about the clinical outcomes and the association with those care processes? So they looked across greenhouse homes, those greenhouse homes that had higher hospital transfer rates, greenhouse homes that had lower hospital transfer rates. Now, arguably, the greenhouse model is probably the most prescriptive model that there is out there. And so the second question, and why the variability? What's causing the variability within everybody doing the same thing? So here's what they did. They conducted interviews, a total of 84 interviews. It was qualitative research, and you can see the folks that they interviewed, quite a few of them. And here's the take home. Yes, the greenhouse model does create significant opportunities for impacting quality and cost. So taking a look at the physical structure, that real home, that core value, the physical structure, there really is something about everybody coming and going through a single entry point. There really is something about those common areas, that everybody is mixing and mingling in those common spaces. And what about the common table, the one table in a greenhouse home? It's a hub of a lot of activity. A lot can happen by virtue of this physical structure. So the impact, Shabazim says, well, you can't hide in a greenhouse home. You know, when the doctor's coming, when the DON's coming, you're there and you see who's coming and going. And as a matter of fact, you just kind of bump into each other, and conversations can happen as a result of that. So contrast that to a traditional nursing home, where you've got people coming and going from all sorts of different directions. So it makes a big difference, this physical structure piece. Here are some other influential elements that they found, and you'll see the table kind of delineates those items that were implemented and carried out consistently, and those items where there was some variability. So on the left-hand side, Shabazim, consistent assignment, consistent across all of the greenhouse homes that were in the research. Shabazim were working in a universal role. So they had a multi-perspective view of the elder, from a dining, because they were cooking for the elders, from cleaning. They were able to see what was going on in the elders' rooms, and obviously from a care perspective. A small number of elders. Greenhouse homes are no more than 12, and most of our homes are about 10 elders in each home. So that small number of elders. It was a small house, and the common kitchen and the hearth areas. So the floor plan was pretty consistently the same. Here are the elements that were implemented with some variability. Shabazim empowerment, and I'll talk more about that. The nurse consistent assignment. While Shabazim had consistent assignments, not all the nurses were consistently assigned to the elders. In addition to that, not all of those working in a greenhouse home were using the central front door as the entry point. And what about the doorbell? Who would ever think that using a doorbell in a greenhouse home might create an opportunity for greater impact? So variability there as well. So here you go. Here's the beginning of a matrix to take a look at. So these select greenhouse elements that I just talked about, the common area, the universal worker, consistent assignment, really created greater familiarity with elders. Shabazim were saying, you know their routine, you know their rhythm, you know all those little quirks about the elder, you know functional abilities, so you know when something is not right. In addition to that, the increased frequency of interaction, that small size, and folks using that single entry, using the doorbell, it really created those opportunities for that increased communication, collaboration, that interaction, so that you'd better be able to pick up on changes in elder condition. So that is all coming together to create these opportunities. But how those opportunities were used, different story. There were some with low hospital transfer rates that maximized the use of opportunities. Others did not leverage the opportunities, had higher transfer rates. So let's unpack it a little bit more. So in the low hospital transfer rates, here's what was reported through the interviews in this research. Mostly the therapists, they were saying, we deliberately schedule our time in the homes when we know the primary care physician might be there. We know the elder schedules. We know exactly when we need to be in there. So we'll have the opportunity to communicate and to collaborate any changes that we're seeing with the physician. In addition to that, the management said, we want to limit the number of providers. They actually had conversations with limiting the amount of nurse practitioners and physicians that were making referrals and following the elders in greenhouse home. So there were fewer people coming and going in that greenhouse home and interacting with staff. In addition to that, they wanted to make sure that there was the accessibility, that there was a couple nurse practitioners that they said they were unapproachable. Well, they said, we want to be able to ensure that the opportunity to communicate, to collaborate, to be approachable, that's important to us. And the nurse skill mix, really making sure that nurses had Shabazim empowerment. Very different here. And I remember Carmen this morning talked about surplus safety, and you used the hand that went down and said surplus safety. We kind of always done this and kept elders safe, safe, safe at all costs, including restraints. And then we said, no, let them do whatever they want to do. Similarly, in interpreting empowerment, Because CNAs have oftentimes had very little power, very little opportunity to really make a difference in the elder's life and to really have an impact on what happened, I think empowerment went boop, and they started thinking, I'm in charge, and I will decide what happens with the elder. So that was kind of to the extreme and not exactly the healthiest interpretation of empowerment. But those Shabazim who interpreted empowerment as, I'm responsible, I am a vital part of a team. The buck stops with me in that I need to be the one to communicate the changes as I see the changes. And I need to go as quickly to the appropriate people to communicate those changes. And if I don't feel enough is being done, I need to advocate for the elder because I'm responsible. Very different from I'm in charge, I make all the decisions, to I'm a vital part of the team. And so you can see here in this next kind of matrix, the dividing line being on the green side, those were some things with more consistency, but the dividing line comes there, and the blue box says how opportunities were used. Really, really significant. So at the top, at the bottom, I should say, the interpretation of empowerment, very different there. At the top, the health professionals maximizing their availability and so forth. I'm going to show you another one right here. The hospital transfers. Lower hospital transfers had everything to do with the early communication about the condition changing. So maximizing those opportunities, really understanding empowerment so that they were able to collaborate earlier. When a Shabazz in that deep knowing recognized they're not the same. When the nurse comes in or the therapist comes in, they're able to very quickly say, something is not right with Mr. Jones. And I have to say, in a greenhouse home, I always say it's all about relationships. And not just relationships between Shabazim and elders, but relationships between Shabazim and nurses, between Shabazim and family members, between nurses and family members, between doctors and Shabazim. It is all about relationships, and it's multifaceted. It's not just limited to deep knowing relationships with Shabazim and elders. Because when relationships happen well, trust happens. When you deeply know someone, you build trust. And we found in low hospital transfer homes that there was trust between the primary care physician and the staff because they had built those relationships. And the family had trust in the staff because they had built those relationships. And the staff had a commitment, a wholesale commitment to the elder. We have a saying, elders rule in a greenhouse home. And to get power to the elder, you have to be committed to the elder and the elder's choice and their autonomy to make choices. And it's that commitment, that staff buy-in. And empowerment seen as a team player. Contrast that to greenhouse homes where there were higher transfer rates. It was really the type of treatment and time to treatment. The delay occurred because Shabazim thought, I'm in charge. And, they weren't really feeling that sense of I'm a part of the team. It was still feeling a little bit more like roles. So that delay in communication was a delayed time to treatment and often ended up as a hospitalization. Sometimes it was the physician not feeling confident in the nurse's abilities. Part of that was just the lack of relationships, the lack of trust. And this is where sometimes in homes with low transfer rates, management would really step in if they felt that physicians, there was one story where a physician said, I go to the DON because that's the way we do it. The DON is the one with the power, the knowledge, the information, and that's where I'm going to go to get my information about the elders in a greenhouse home. Higher transfer rates in those homes. But when physicians trusted staff, they were able to go to the Shabazz and recognize That's my go-to. They're the ones that have the information. The physician not familiar with staff. It's all about relationships. So where there wasn't that familiarity, there was lack of trust and confidence in the staff's ability to handle something in a home as opposed to sending them to the hospital. The staff uncomfortable approaching the PCP, I talked about that, an unapproachable nurse practitioner. Oftentimes, that they said, we're not going to talk to her. She's just not approachable. And so they kind of left that alone. And multiple providers involved. It's much harder to build relationships when you've got a lot of different providers coming and going. End-of-life care. They talked about having those difficult conversations. Much easier to have a conversation about end-of-life care when it's all about relationships. And relationships have really happened between the family members and between the physician and family members and Shabazim. Shabazim knowing what the elder and family prefer, knowing those preferences, knowing who they are and really how they feel about things. The primary care physician said much easier to talk to family members when we've really felt that trust and they felt confident in the staff in the greenhouse homes. And really knowing the staff well enough to know what they could do either way. So here you'll see the impact of those variations. And this is kind of what the Thrive researchers kind of put together. You can see those consistent elements on the left-hand side of your screen. And those were the elements those greenhouse elements, this model holistically changing things really does create those opportunities. But there you see in the middle the divergent path, and at the top is where they maximized opportunities that led to decreased time to treatment, and typically end-of-life care was offered in a greenhouse home as opposed to sending someone out to the hospital. That interpretation of empowerment right there in the middle, and then down at the bottom you can see again failure to maximize the opportunities really led to a delayed time to treatment, and most of the time, instead of end of life in a greenhouse home, they were sent off to the hospital. So, living the model, what does this mean in the day-to-day, and what does it look like in light of what research has shown us? I'm going to ask Cheryl to come and tell some of her experiences about really what it's like to live it on the day-to-day.
Okay, now I get to tell some stories. But first, I think it's important that you know that I did work in a 101-bed traditional nursing home before our greenhouse. I am the guide. I function as the administrator in the DON. So one of my favorite stories is about George. He was an elder that lived at the legacy home, the traditional nursing home. And staff would awaken him in the morning at about 5:36 a.m., and George didn't want to wake up. He would kick, hit, spit, and swear. So things didn't go very well in the morning. And then another thing they wanted to do, part of his restorative plan of care, was that he would walk to the dining room, and after being awakened, he didn't feel like doing that. So he was being pushed to the dining room in a wheelchair. So he lost some function. He wasn't able to walk. So he moved to the greenhouse homes, and staff were letting him sleep in. He was getting up about 8:30, 9 a.m., and no more of these behaviors were occurring. Amazing. And because he was awakening on his own, staff were able to assist him as he ambulated to the dining room table. And his wife was just amazed. She didn't know that he could walk. So that small environment that they talk about with the greenhouse homes, that really impacted George's life. Another story is about alarms, and Carmen's sitting right here. She's got a wonderful book as a resource. But I thought, I'm ashamed to say, I had to go to a conference, and I heard I heard a DON of a 180-bed traditional nursing home who did long-term and short-term rehab and how their journey to becoming alarm-free. And I thought, wow, if they can do it, we should be able to do it. So I came home from the conference and I started talking about it. And let's just say some of the staff were concerned. But I shared Carmen's book. Some of them read it. And then they just started, well, I think we can do this. And that would have never occurred in the traditional nursing home. So one of the elders, her name was Oda, she had a chair alarm, and Oda liked to spend a lot of time out in the garden. And she would come in, she spent a lot of time in the garden, and she would come in the home and we would just see her ambulate her toilet, go to the bathroom, her alarm would sound, we would come running. Even though we were in the kitchen and kind of observing her doing this. So the staff said, well, let's just check out when her alarm is sounding. And they did that for like a week. Her alarm sounded 3 different times during that week. And it was for that same reason. She was just coming in from the garden and wanted to go to the bathroom. So it was just so neat to see the staff figure that out, and that Oda no longer had to sit on this chair alarm, and they just anticipated her needs. She was just coming in the house and going to her bathroom. So the staff in the greenhouse home, and I worked in that traditional nursing home, and from Michigan, and there'd be a nice day, and lo and behold, you'd have staff call in, especially if it was Friday and it was sunny. It was just like every day you were short-staffed. So going to the greenhouse homes, people were concerned because we didn't have on call, we didn't have, people didn't have to be mandated to stay over. So they were concerned, what are you going to do if somebody doesn't show up for work? People show up for work. They do it because they care deeply for the elders. It's amazing. If they do call in, they're going to find their own replacement. And it was like 13 months before a nurse ever missed a shift, let alone a Shabazim. And, you know, life happens. Sometimes people can't show up, flat tire or whatever, but they just, they make it happen and they show up for work. So I think it's one of the amazing things, too. And I think earlier she talked about the relationship with the physician. Our doctor doesn't usually ask me what's going on. He goes right to the Shabazz. So as a nurse, sometimes that's hard. But she knows that they know those elders so well. And if she has a question, she's going to go and ask them.
So I have to kind of laugh at myself, as the fact that I'm presenting in a research track is kind of hilarious, because usually if I see that at a conference, I'm like, well, not going to that one, because that's just not a part of There's just so many opportunities for us at Greenhouse, but I think for culture change in general. So I'm very excited to share another piece of the research. And first of all, that term sustainability, I remember, 10, 12 years ago, it was like the buzzword was empowerment. And it was like, we were talking about empowerment, and, as you can see, 12 years later, there's still kind of a interpretation that's different in empowerment. And I think the same can be true sometimes in sustainability. Well, what does that really mean, and what does that really look like? So I usually go to the dictionary, and it might be a little bit difficult to read, but sustainability is the things that we do to keep up, to keep going, an action or a process. So what is it that we can maintain and keep happening? And so as I was trying to wrap my head around what does sustainability really mean and what does it look like, I started doing just a lot of searches on the internet, and I came across an organization that's outside of long-term care. Because one of the things that the researchers came to understand is there's been a lot of research about long-term care culture change, but most of it has been focused on that initial implementation process. And there's really very little research about what is sustainability and what happens for that ongoing sustainability. So I started looking outside of long-term care and found an organization called The Forum. And they operate in the business world. They support businesses internationally. They do research. And this is a few things that I found. But one of the most intriguing things that I found is a study that they did. And they did it about in 2007 or 8, over 200. Said they felt effective in making behavior change stick. So some of the struggles that we have in long-term care are pretty universal across any kind of organization. So through this research, what they found was there's really 3 main initiatives in sustaining change and making behavior change stick. So there's this bucket of aligning, and it's all of the things that we do to cast a vision, to get us going in the same direction together. So there's the aligning. And then the next phase is the equipping. So it's the skill building, it's the training, it's the education, it's giving staff the resources to be successful in whatever change process we're talking about. And then it's the efforts that fall into that sustaining bucket. So what we're doing kind of in terms of ongoing support and reinforcement of whatever behavior change we want to stick. Organizational resources would you say they dedicated in the aligning phase? 70%. Any other guesses? They have full confidence in you, Anna, that you got that right. So what they found was 20%. Organizations typically devoted 20% of resources in that aligning phase. So how about the next one? What's your guess? 60%? Oh, winner. So for me, that fits pretty well with my paradigm because I've spent the bulk of my career in that equipping, giving training and education. But what they found is that where they found the impact in terms of sustainability, 34% of the time, only 10% of the time when the bulk of resources were put in, and the impact was 55% of the time in terms of sustainability. So when I read this research, I said, there's something to this that we have to figure out. How do we take this information and really figure out how do we help organizations sustain and what does that really look like? And when they asked the organizations, they said, they got it, that it was not just about giving people the tools and resources, that there needed to be some reinforcement. And they further had ideas about what that reinforcement ideas, what that would look like. So you do a training and then you could do some of these things. But they said, in reality, we only have so much time and energy. And so putting on a training, giving that education to people, it just got left behind, those sustainability actions. So another piece of data from this same survey was here were some of the main reasons for the lack of sustainment. And that might be a little bit difficult to read, but they said it was about lack of management commitment, insufficient measurement, and we talk about what gets measured gets managed. So if there was no measurement system, it kind of got left behind. Lack of employee commitment, poor communication, and lack of integration with work. So people just felt like, we say things like, well, it's just the flavor of the month. So it just felt like one more thing that people had to do, but it didn't feel like it was integrated into the overall organization. So we take this piece of research in context, and then we say, okay, what does that mean for the second research study by the Thrive researchers? And this research study was conducted by Barb Bowers and Kim Nolette, and it was another qualitative study of 11 greenhouse homes and 166 staff that they interviewed. And here's some of the initial questions that they asked the staff, and then from that they were able to drill down even further. And the purpose of the study was to really describe how the principles and practices of the greenhouse model are being sustained at a sampling of greenhouse skilled nursing homes, and really focusing on the conditions that influence reinforcing of the model or eroding the model. So, we're going to unpack this graphic here, and then what we've done to additionally kind of interpret and understand and move it forward in terms of that application. So at the top, those 4 boxes, they said those are the 4 types of problems that typically occur in a greenhouse home, and I would say in any long-term care environment. So it is the critical events, the organizational issues, the daily routine, and the gradual changes. Things happen that could probably be put in one of those boxes that necessitate a decision to be made, a problem to be solved. And then it's figuring out what really happens in that triangle. So Susan mentioned it's the black box of greenhouse. It's also kind of the gray triangle, and figuring out what's happening in the gray triangle. That whatever happened in that problem-solving process would either reinforce the model or erode the model. So as we look at this, here's the types of problems. A critical event. Something happens that requires an immediate response. It could be a survey citation. It could be an elder elopement. So things like that happen. Organizational issues. So there are things like staying on budget, hiring of staff. The third category are the daily routine issues. So the scheduling, ordering of supplies, the things that happen just day to day in managing the home. And then the last category was the gradual changes. So the challenges that happen as people age in place and their acuity rises, or it could be as staffing changes happen after being open and operating for a while. So those are the types of problems that necessitate a problem to be solved. And what they came to see is that there are really 3 patterns of problem solving. The first one was what they called the coach collaborative. So this was the Shabazim, or the self-managed work teams. They were guided by the guide and mentored to make the decision. And there was a high understanding and a high commitment to the values. Cheryl talked about, staff come to work because they love the elders. So there was that high commitment to the values that we hold in this model. And so the coach collaborated with the staff to problem solve and make the decisions. That was the first type. The second one is what they said was management led. And it was led by a manager, quite often the guide, who understood the model, who had a high commitment to the values, but the solution, so the process was more traditional in terms of the manager leader making it, but the solution often reinforced the model because they had that high commitment to the model. It was a little bit of a mixed bag. Sometimes the solution actually eroded the model. And then the third one was they labeled that the hierarchical model. So the Shabazim were generally excluded from the decision-making process, and the decisions were held at a leadership level. It was often, they referred to it as kind of a siloed process. It was adversarial. And the Shabazim were excluded for various reasons. It could be that confidence and trust that they were able to make the decision, but for whatever reason, Both the process didn't honor the value of empowered staff, and often the solutions also further eroded the model because they went with that go-to kind of traditional way of thinking. So those were how decisions were made. Research saying what really happened. We got in terms of, okay, we understand the types of problems, the types of happens, we understand there's different ways of making decisions, but what of threat, the authority, and the keeper of the philosophy and values. So I want to unpack that a little bit more, and you can see that the pattern of problem solving, when it reinforced the model, they were using either more of the coaching collaborative or the management led, and when it eroded the model, it was the hierarchical and sometimes the management led. So let me break down these factors to sustaining change. And one of the things that the Thrive researchers have helped us to understand is that a model gets eroded or reinforced one decision at a time. And so it's really important to understand, how does decisions get made so we can keep reinforcing the model and do less of eroding the model. So, degree of collaboration, and I have a lot of notes here. So the degree of collaboration, there were a couple different factors. So the model was reinforced when the Shabazim, when there was a belief in their capacity and they had the opportunity. So much of this was led by the work of a guide who believed in this collaborative process, who operated as a mentor. Also the clinical support team who come in partnership with them, where leaders said, I am going to pull back from my natural tendency to kind of swoop in and make the decision. That's my go-to way, but I'm going to do things differently. I think also what we learned from the earlier study in terms of the interpretation of empowerment. So this is where if a Shabazim said, I'm a part of a collaborative team, then I approach things differently, then I get to decide, and it's all about me. I think the other piece from the forum research said it's not just about building the skills in people, but if it's the guide, the other staff people that are supporting the Shabazim that are saying, okay, we learned this problem-solving method when you went through core team education. And we call that exploring options. And so the guide says, okay, let's go back to that, because it's not going to automatically stick in your brains the first time you learn it, but let's go back to that and give some mentoring and teaching and really believe that they have the capacity to do that. So all of that kind of fits under the bucket of the degree of collaboration. The next one was the perceived severity of threat. So this comes in how we view the nature of problems. So if it was believed that whatever the problem to be solved was really posed existential threat to the organization, well, then they tended to have that hierarchical approach to problem solving, and leaders really led that decision-making process. But if they believed that it did not require an immediate response, but we could slow down the process, and it could be a more collaborative process, then they tended to let the Shabazim control that decision-making process. So that was the first one, the nature of the problems. How do we look at problems? The second one was around budgetary issues. So what they found was that the fewer budgetary pressures that the organization had, the more likely Shabazim were able to make the decisions. And as those budgetary issues kind of became greater and greater, that it became more of that management-led decision-making or that hierarchical approach. And then the third one was, again, around the perception of the state survey team. So if the organization believed that the state survey department was supportive of the model and supportive of decision-making at the hands of the elders or as close to the elders as possible, then it became more of that coach collaborative. If the organization believed that the survey team was critical, that when they came in, they were going to really challenge the model, then they tended to hold on to that decision-making. Authority in decision-making. So this is really looking at the role of the guide. In the early days of the greenhouse model, the guide tended to have a dual role, such as Cheryl has, being the administrator and being the guide. And there are still several organizations where the guide plays that role. And one of the challenges that they found is you're wearing multiple hats. And so for a guide, it can be difficult to say, okay, in this instance, it really is a management-led decision. But in this instance, when I'm in the greenhouse home, it needs to be more of that coach collaborative, and we need to work together, and I need to really listen to the Shabazim and let them lead the process. So this was a realization, just the challenges that the guide has. Also to have the guides reported not always having adequate time to be in that coaching role. They also found that when the guide, whether the guide was the administrator, there are other times where the guide is one of the clinical support team members. So it could be a social worker, an activity director that also is a guide for one or more houses. And what they found is, depending on how thin that guide was spread, if he or she had multiple roles, there was a little bit of a tendency to kind of swoop in, not have a time to really have a thorough understanding of what the issue is. I got to make a decision. And again, feeling kind of that time pressure of not being able to thoroughly understand the issue and being in that coaching role. So that was some of the challenges around the authority in decision making. And then the last area is about being the keeper of the philosophy and the values and the practices. And Nancy Fox this morning talked about, it's all about leadership and the powerful role that leaders play. And what they found was leaders that are committed to the model, that are real champions for the model, that set that as the standard, the model tends to get reinforced. If there is a leader that doesn't have a thorough understanding of the model or doesn't embrace it as much, it tends to be more of that hierarchical approach. So one of the implications of this is when leaders turn over, what's our process for educating them, getting them on board, really getting them to continue to be the champion of the model? We often talk about leaders don't have answers, they ask good, curious questions, and whether it's an organizational, formal leader, a guide role, asking those questions, being the keeper of the philosophy, saying things like, how does this decision help us honor the value of meaningful life? Or how does this decision help us honor the real home for the elders? So Susan mentioned the doorbell, the use of the doorbell. That helps us live out the value of real home. And so a guide and a coach would ask the question, if we start just having staff come in the back door or having their key fobs that they're just let in, how does that help us really honor real home for the elders, and really challenges that and really keeps those values alive for the team? So, Cheryl.
I love some of these pictures. That's a picture of an elder from our home with one of the Shabazz. So I'm trying to tell some stories that support the findings of the research, and another one related to the empowered staff. We had one of the Shabazz. She fell down her basement stairs one morning and she injured her shoulder and wasn't going to be able to come to work. She was working for us full time. She called the home. I didn't find out about this until after lunch, but anyways, she wasn't going to be able to work, and I found out about it, and I usually don't help the staff with the scheduling, but I thought under the circumstances I was just going to ask them if they needed my help in making some calls. And I went over there and they thanked me and then told me that once other Shabazim found out that she was unable to work, they called, and all her shifts were picked up for like the next 6 weeks. And it was just amazing what they do and how they collaborate together when there's an issue like that. I talked about our friend Oda, who liked to spend time in the garden, and she liked to deadhead living and dead things. And as a result, she got a lot of skin tears and scratches on her fingers. And so the staff thought, let's have her wear gloves. That was going to be the intervention. And that didn't go over very well with this elder because she liked to feel the plants, you know, that gave her a lot of pleasure. She had grown up on a farm out in Iowa. But anyways, then she wouldn't keep them on, so she's non-compliant now. And what are we going to do? So they figured it out. Well, I guess she's not going to wear the gloves, and that we're going to care plan it because she wants to be out in the garden. We're going to let her keep going out in the garden, and she doesn't have to wear those gloves unless she one day decided to wear them. So I am the keeper of the philosophy. I am reminded of that from time to time, but the same elder, Oda, out in the garden, and this was after those alarms were discontinued, and I came to work on a Monday morning, and I just kind of roamed through both houses, and I was out in the garden, and I noticed that all the benches and the chairs were turned around, and I thought, what the heck? Well, what had happened is this elder had self-transferred, so she couldn't do that to keep her safe. So that's when I have a conversation with the staff. So, why did you think that was a great intervention? And so as we have a conversation, they realize, it's okay for her to self-transfer onto that bench, that there's going to be some risk in letting her out in the garden by herself. But, if you don't have some risk, you're not living, and risk is a part of life. So that was just a story about Oda and the bench.
So, what's our response once we have an understanding, and I think we're still wrapping our heads around what does this all mean, and what do we need to do in response to really help support sustainability? I think one of the things is that we've started to share this. So when you look at those 4 categories, the keeper of the philosophy, the perceived severity of threat, the authority, and the collaboration in decision making, the degree of collaboration, as we've shared that with some greenhouse homes, pretty quickly then they've been able to identify this is where we're really strong and this is where there's opportunities. So I shared it at one organization, and I got through all 4 of them, and they're like, that's it. We've lost the keeper of our philosophy. So they had a formal leader who had retired, and there was nobody, they believed, there were plenty of people that believed, but nobody in that formal role that was kind of bearing that torch and saying, this is why we're doing what we're doing. And so once they identified that, they were able to say, okay, let's strategize. Is it going to be a couple of us that are really going to take that mantle on and really run with it, or what are we going to do? Another organization said, that perceived severity of threat, we had an incident. State came in, and so now we're afraid. And so we make decisions, and the process that we make decisions is based on that. So we tend to be more management-led or hierarchical, and we got to get through that. So it's both not just looking at the deficits, but it's also looking at, but we're really strong in, we have a guide that works. The Shabazim team, they know problem solving. They know that method, and we just need to unleash them and not hold on to control so much. So we've had some applications. So this is our response, the Model Integrity Assessment Tool. So this has been a process that's been going on for a few years. So the forum research said one of the reasons for the lack of sustainment is that there was a lack of measurement. And so we've realized that while Greenhouse is a prescriptive model, we didn't have that mechanism to help people really with the model integrity side of it. So far before I started with the Greenhouse project, this process was started. And Anna was very involved in working with the peer network, Model Integrity Committee. I believe Rhonda was a part of it. Cheryl has been a part of it, where we've really looked at our 3 core values and our essential practices and said, okay, but how do we measure that and what does that really look like? So we had a very collaborative process of really identifying what that might be so that we could help organizations to assess themselves. There was an initial tool put together. It was piloted. We gathered a lot of information. And at the same time that we went through that pilot process, the Thrive research study was concluded. And so we said, okay, how do we pull in that information along with the information we got from this pilot process? So we've been going through this year, the end of last year and this year, been going through some revisions, saying how do we make it a user-friendly tool? How do we make it where they're getting some real results, where they're able to see these are the areas that we're strong, and again, here's our opportunities to really maximize the model. And so I'm excited that it's going